Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Read Hall. Welcome to the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination. I'm Sari Castro, and I'm the Programming and Communications Coordinator. I'm really happy to welcome you all for this special evening. Jana was a fellow at the Institute in 2024, and what happens here once you're a fellow is that you will always be one. So that's why we immediately say yes when she asked us to be part of this special moment. We are excited to celebrate the publication of Étienne Balibar sur la guerre, the first volume of the new series of small theory books in English and in French, published by Suture Press in a hardbound edition with illustrations by Nela Klímová. The volume brings together three essays in which the philosopher Étienne Balibar analyzes the notion of war. You can buy the book at the end of the event, and hopefully you can get them signed. Um, Let me introduce our speakers before giving them the word. Etienne Balibar is a philosopher and former student of Louis Althusser. He is a professor emeritus at University Paris 10 Nanterre and the University of California, Irvine. He's a main figure in contemporary philosophy and political theory, as he has played a central role in rethinking concepts like citizenship, borders, and equality in a globalized world, often bridging classical Marxism with modern concerns about democracy and human rights. His last works include Citizen Subject, Foundations for Philosophical Anthropology, and Secularism and Cosmopolitanism. Jana Ndiaye Berankova is an art and architecture theorist, philosopher, writer, publisher, and currently a researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Science. She is the author of L'éclat de l'absolu, Dialogue avec Alain Badiou, published last year by Suture Press. She studied at the École Normale Supérieure, the EHESS, and Columbia University, where she completed her PhD dissertations on the links between architecture theory and French philosophy from 1965 to 1990. Jana runs the Suture Press and has an upcoming novel called Promise of Future Happiness in Argo in Czech. Taek-Gwang Lee is professor of philosophy and cultural studies at Kyung-hee University in Seoul, where he directs both the Center for Cross-Cultural Studies and the Global Center of Technology in Humanities. He is also research fellow at Jan Evangelista Perkin University. His publication includes Communism After Deleuze and Made in Nowhere, Essays of the Asiatic Modes of Production. Thank you so much for coming, and have a nice evening.
So thank you so much for coming, everyone, to celebrate what today is the launch of Étienne Balibar, little book called Sur la guerre, or On War, in what will be the little series of theory books at Suture Press, published by basically at the rhythm of 2 per year. Of which we're also here celebrating the launch, and hopefully after this event there will be drinks in the garden, so we can talk informally. Before actually explaining the idea of this series and this book project, I just want to start by thanking everyone who has been involved in publishing this book, making it happen, and in organizing this event. So obviously, I'll start by thanking to the director of this institute, Marie Dorigny, who's unfortunately not here, but also to Sari Castro and Alice Pittini for helping us with organizing the event. I would also like to thank my collaborator from Suture, Arnaud Taillefer, and Nicolas Fresneau for some help with careful editing of the book. Most importantly, I would like to thank Nela Klímová, a Czech graphic designer from the Studio Zobrazení, for the beautiful graphic design and illustrations for the book. And obviously Etienne for this great manuscript, and Alex for flying 17 hours from Korea through the North Pole to be here with us. I also want to thank the Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences, whose grant Strategie 21, or Strategy 21, actually made this event possible, and the Culture Moves European Union program, which also has been involved in funding this event. What I would like to do today is just to say a few words about the publishing project, and then obviously I'll pass a word to my guests. Some of you might remember that last year in this very same room we were celebrating the launch of my book L'éclat de l'absolu, dialogue with Alain Badiou. So when we began working on this book, what we didn't know, and maybe we could have guessed it, but we didn't know that we were gonna be publishing this book in an epoch whose predominant drive nowadays seems to be that of the death drive, an epoch in which precious palaces and books are being burned down in an AI-assisted warfare of a declining imperial hegemony. We didn't know that we were going to publish this book. I mean, we could have guessed that we were going to publish this book in an epoch in which the majority of us belonging to various streams of the left, whether Marxist, communist, Trotskyist, or any other bizarre situationist, or I don't know, will be desperately searching for any form of hope. This is why I propose today to launch this series of small theory books, which I name constellations or constellations, because the books will be in English and in French, depending on the manuscript. A series that's broadly focused on Marxism, continental philosophy, psychoanalysis, theory of art, architecture, and so on. And we're basically searching for shorter books with compelling titles, which, as I said, we'll try to keep them either in English or in French. The Constellation, number 1, is Étienne Balibar's manuscript Sur la guerre, trois interprétations. And in September, we'll be publishing a constellation, number 2, which will be a book by Czechoslovak Marxist theorists with 3 essays from the 1930s. It will be called Poetry and Revolution.
So at last, the series will become Marxist.
Yeah.
Number 2.
Oh. And obviously, we're curious to accept manuscripts. When I was thinking about the title of the series, you know, obviously, my first idea was Mallarmé.
A Marxist?
No, come on. You're going to torture me. So, an aristocratic communist. Never mind. So, when I was imagining the title of this series, my first thought was that of Mallarmé. Because if we think of constellations, constellations are possible imagined combinations of stars that create intelligible figures out of pure chaos, a chaos that we might be living through today. In other words, out of the inconsistent multiplicities of the universe. And obviously, we know that at the end of Mallarmé's A Throw of Dice Will Never Abolish Chance, there's a constellation as a metaphor for the wager of the axiomatic orientation of thought. I also thought about the citation of someone Etienne might not like to hear about, but who was for many still is the master of my thought, who was Alain Badiou, when he cited he once said in an interview that we did for L'éclat de l'absolu, but I think it's not actually in the book. It was like an informal conversation.
An extraordinary book.
Yeah. Thank you.
Best I've ever
And he said something like, Quand le réel fait défaut, il faut retourner au principe. Meaning, when the real is failing, we have to return to the principles, which again might be the orientation for today's moment, chaotic moment. Then somehow it happened to me that I was reading Alex's little book on the way how philosophers interpret paintings, which is called The Color of Concepts. And this book actually includes a brief chapter on Benjamin. And this chapter suddenly reminded me that even though I was thinking about doing Mallarmé, actually there might be a Benjaminian unconscious that creeped in back into the axiom that I thought I was putting in the title of this series. Because obviously, if we think of Benjamin's and his epistemocritical prologue to Trauerspiel, The Origin of German Tragic Drama, he says things like these. He says that ideas are related to things as constellations are to stars. He also says, another quote, that ideas are eternal constellations And inasmuch as the elements are grasped as points in such constellations, the phenomena are simultaneously divided out and saved. And if you look at the book, you will see those beautiful illustrations done by Nela, composed of points. In the color of concepts, actually, you talk about Benjamin, you talk about the way how the painting itself is a form of philosophical engagement with material culture. And Alex mentions Benjamin's collections, including his rare books and various cultural artifacts that formed what Benjamin called actually constellations of meaning. And in fact, each object in Benjamin's collection, like his Angelus Novus, served as a point of convergence for historical and philosophical and personal significance. Obviously, we all know that this ended a little bit like a tragedy, with Benjamin's forced abandonment of his library during his exile from Nazi Germany, and in fact a dissolution of a carefully constructed intellectual universe. And Alex writes something, I quote here, that like Klee's angel, Benjamin's library stood as a material manifestation of his philosophical method, a method that sought to understand truth through the careful arrangement and interpretation of cultural objects. So perhaps I would return that and ask, is a book in fact a form of a dialectical image? And we know that right now, when we read on war, we're in a situation where books are burned. And in fact, maybe the book is like a bottle with a handwritten message that we, les naufragés, or the shipwrecked survivors, are throwing into the sea of despair and chaos of this world, hoping that this message will actually find its recipient on the other side of the ocean. And that brings us back to Mallarmé and his figure of the master, who obviously is also throwing the dice into the sea. And the poem ends with, excepté peut-être une constellation. So in fact, what we're facing now is something like a sinking boat of communism that perhaps needs to be rebuilt. And what remains from the sinking boat might be the books. Our hope that even in case of war, some of these messages in a bottle will land somewhere in some part of the world and talk to those who might come after us and who might be smarter than us, who knows. So in fact, in Suture Press or Édition Suture, I would say that what we're trying to do is to search for an adequate material expression of an idea, like we can do in architecture, painting, or perhaps even fashion, where we're trying to give a certain material form to a certain conceptual idea. So the very form, the material form, the quality of paper, quality of graphic design is what matters here. In Sur la guerre, and Alex will be talking about it in much more detail, Étienne discusses Marx and Clausewitz and Simone Weil's rereading of the Illiad. When we were working on the graphic design of the book, we were looking for something that would be perhaps less direct than the omnipresent atrocities of our contemporary world. And that's where, we decided to, in fact, to go back to the Trojan War, using the motifs of the antique friezes, which, again, Nela Klímová, the graphic designer, turned into these beautiful constellations composed of dots, and I think it makes a really beautiful design. But perhaps this series, Constellations, which I hope will continue, is itself a kind of an assemblage like this of meaning, of small texts, theory books, which hopefully will be always as beautiful as this one. And I just invite you all to follow us in that and have a look at the books and have a look at our website and e-shop and just support us so that we can just continue and survive despite the difficulties of the publishing and the political situation and everything. So now I would like to pass word to Alex, if you may.
Not for a discourse instead of yours, just for the gesture. Because when preparing my spirits, so to speak, for this event, I thought that I should find a way to express my gratitude to Jana. And the one I found is very French. I'm sorry for that. It's extremely French. It's an application of the well-known motto Dites-le avec des fleurs. This is for you, Jana.
I'm very fortunate to see Etienne's gesture, very French gesture, and then I'm also quite fortunate to read this book, the earliest moment when it was, the manuscript. I was really the shocked when I read this book because actually I thought we are facing up now is a return of a war. The age of war is restarted, but Etienne already discussed many years ago, and then through his own the struggle to bring in some philosophical conceptualization of the world, and then he actually settled down the why we came to have this kind of the return of the war again. So, and then how can we actually face this reality? That's why I'm really actually impressed by his writing, and I think this is a really timely book, and then also very important book we must read in the actually the age of the war. So I saved my time, and I just start my talk. Of course, I want to express my gratitude to Jana and to allow me attend this kind of fantastic event. And then I'm really honored to be here, and then honored to meet you. So I want to begin with a question that I think runs beneath all three essays in this collection, even when it is not explicitly named. The question is this: what does force do to human beings? The actual force is a key concept in this text. So not what force is. He didn't try to define what force is in the abstract sense. Not force as concept in political theory or military doctrine, but what it does. That is what, as far as I read this text, Étienne Balibar tried to do. So what it does to those who suffer it, and crucially, what it does to those who wield it. So both sides. So I raised this question at what feels like an almost unbearably exact historical moment. Jana described, chaotic moment. As this book goes to press, and as we come together to mark its publication, the war against Iran has passed from the realm of speculation into political reality. And what is striking, what is philosophically and politically arresting, is that arguments being made for confrontation are not new. This is a kind of repetition. So they are the same arguments that have been made in different registers. For decades, superior force, swift resolution, the management of an empirical problem by overwhelming means. You might be familiar with this kind of rhetoric. The same fantasy of mastery, the same ideological blindness to the historical field. This book does not address Iran directly, but it provides, I want to argue, the most precise theoretical instrument we currently have for understanding what is at stake and what is being catastrophically missed. This is Simone Weil's question, and it marks the beginning of the book, Weil's essay on the Illiad. I really love this essay by the Etienne, which Étienne Balibar reads with extraordinary care in the opening piece. Is built around a single demonstrating insight. Force is not a simple power. It is the process by which a living human being is turned into a thing. At its most extreme, it does this directly. It kills. That's force. But Wei's more unsettling observation is that force does not need to kill to dehumanize. It can hold a person suspended between life and death, in terror, in servitude, in humiliation, and in that suspension, something essential is already destroyed. This is kind of a Trump and a MAGA strategy in the United States today. The person is still breathing, but they have already, in some decisive sense, been turned into an object. What Balibar adds to this reading, and this is one of the book's most important moves, is the argument that force is constitutively reversible. This is a very unique reading of force through this base the interpretation of Illiad. Those who wield it are not exempt from its logic. They imagine themselves sovereign, but that sovereignty is always fantasy. The strong are in the end consumed by the same machinery they set in motion. This is not moral consolation, it is a structural diagnosis. And it is, I want to suggest, one of the most politically urgent ideas in the entire collection in this book, because it describes with almost surgical precision the logic currently being enacted toward Iran. Of course, Iran is not an empty screen onto which the West can project its fantasies. It is one of the historical formation in which the unresolvable contradiction of the 20th century remain most intensely alive. The 1953 coup, the 1979 revolution, the Iran-Iraqi war, prosecuted with Western complicity, decades of punishing sanctions, and the sustained theological political mobilization whose entire genealogy is inseparable from its anti-imperial condition of emergence. To approach this formation as though superior force could reset it, as though history itself could be neutralized by shock and spectacle, is to enact in aggravated in a form precisely the ideological era this book anatomizes. Force, as Weil understood, always awaken in its own object forces that exceed the fantasy of mastery. One does not simply manage such a historical formation. One detonates it. Because the Iliad, in Wei's reading, is not ultimately a poem about heroes. It is a poem about what the war does not to everyone it touches, victors and the vanquished alike. And it is a tragic poem in a very precise sense. Tragedy, as Balibar reconstructed it here, is not a catastrophe, not the fall of a great individual. It is something more difficult. The disclosure of a shared human condition in which reversal is always possible, in which the powerful become powerless, in which the logic of domination turns back on itself. The tragic moment, par excellence, in the Iliad is the encounter between Achilles and Priam, the killer and the father of the killed, meeting in the night. Everything in there are tears. There is recognition. There is briefly something like reciprocity between enemies. They calls it a miracle. Balibar is careful not to theologize it. What happens is fragile, human and temporary. Force will return, but for a moment, something else becomes possible. This is conjuncture. So what is at stake in this scene is what Weil herself designates the lost secret of tragedy, the very animating principle of epic as the reads it. For Weil, the suspension of death opens an interval stolen from the ordinary temporality of force. a threshold moment in which reversal becomes structurally possible. What draws Balibar to this formulation is not its ethical dimension, as though the sin were staging the moral virtue of self-restraint or the sympathetic recognition of an enemy's humanity. No more crucially, is it a theological moment in any orthodox sense, in which grace descends as sovereign intervention from the position exterior to the human? Grace in this reading is not a transcendent power, but a name for specific mode of human response, the capacity within the very grip of force to resist petrification, to refuse the reduction to thinghood, and to recognize in the other a shared exposure to destruction, including, with full tragic irony, the destruction one has oneself inflicted. In that suspended interval, the determination of force is momentarily interrupted. Necessarily, a necessity no longer fully governs what comes next. Another path becomes, however fleetingly thinkable. It is precisely this uncertainty that, for Balibar's way, constitutes deepest structural meaning of tragedy. The second essay moves us from Homer to Clausewitz, and the transition in the current conjuncture is less academic than it might appear, because the question that drives the Clausewitz piece is in a different register, the same question: what is the relation between political rationality and violence? Can violence ever remain fully subordinate to political ends? Or does it always, at some point, escape control of those who deploy it? Clausewitz's famous formula, war as continuation of politics by other means, is the starting point. But Balibar's reading is not a summary. It is dismantling. He shows that each of Clausewitz's central axioms is internally unstable. War may be subordinate to politics, but once mobilized, it transforms politics in return. Defense may be strategically superior to offense, but only through reversals that no original plan anticipate. And moral factors, such as patriotism, collective will, the effective and ideological investment of entire population, may prove decisive in ways that exceed what any state can rationally administer. The result is what Balibar calls a productive circularity, a theory that can never fully answer the question it poses. How can violence remain political instrument without escaping political rationality? The answer is that it cannot, not completely, not without remainder. And this remainder is not an accident. It is structural. We are watching this structural remainder assert itself in real time as the political actors orienting themselves toward Iran discover that the strategic calculus they imagined, limited, strike, controlled, escalation, manageable response, is always already exceeded by the forces it sets in motion. This is what Clausewitz knew and what his most reckless contemporary inheritors have forgotten. The war, once begun, has its own logic, and the logic does not respect the intention of those who initiated it. The essay then traces this unresolvable tension through Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao, each of whom inherited Clausewitz and transformed him, and each of whom grasped that subject of war is always fractured, overdetermined, and never fully governable by strategic rationality. What emerged from this genealogy matters directly for the present conjuncture, because Iran is precisely the kind of historical formation as I discussed, in which these overdetermined forces are most intensely concentrated. The victories of Mao and Ho Chi Minh were not merely national events. They were signals of a global mutation in the political form of war itself, guerrilla warfare, establishing that anti-colonial struggle could be generalized, that the guerrilla resistance could be sustained indefinitely against conventionally superior forces, that moral factors in Clausewitz's sense, though now transformed by revolutionary ideology, could outlast technological and military advantage. This is a historical lesson that current architects of confrontation with Iran appear incapable of absorbing. They are fighting strategically and ideologically the last war, or rather, they are fighting a war that never existed outside their own fantasy. Which brings me to Ukraine and to the third essay, which is in many ways the most immediately urgent piece in the collection, and which now needs to be read alongside and against the Iran conjuncture. Balibar argues that the war in Ukraine cannot be understood as a mere regional conflict. It is three words at once: a war of national borders, a geopolitical confrontation between Russia and the Euro-Atlantic bloc, and a global war whose effects through energy, food, sanction, and migration draw countries far from the battlefield into its orbit. He already anticipated, actually the coming of Iran war in this essay. But what Iran crisis forces us to recognize is that fourth war is now superimposed on these three, a war over the very architecture of global order itself, over whether the United States can still function as the guarantor of the rules-based international system, or whether what we are witnessing is the open decomposition of that system's legitimating framework. Because the move toward Iran is not simply a military decision, it is a symptom. It is a symptom of an imperial formation that can no longer justify its violence through liberal humanitarian frictions, that can no longer convincingly embody an universality, and therefore falls back on the naked assertion of the force as its only remaining idiom. What Trump's encouraged reveals in its vulgarity and its theoretical fantasy is not a deviation from the system truth, but the system truth itself, an order that survives only by compulsively repeating its founding violence, that mistakes the staging of a power for the exercise of sovereignty, and that is therefore enacting in the precise psychoanalytic sense a death drive. The Christian fascist milieu surrounding these political formation fantasies about apocalypse, purification, and restoration through fire. But as the tragic logic of Balibar traces in Weil would suggest, the fire does not purify. It reveals the void beneath the fantasy. Balibar insisted in the Ukraine essay that contemporary wars cannot be separated from the planetary ecological crisis applies here with equal and perhaps greater force. A war with Iran will not be contained within the territorial and geopolitical boundaries that military planners nominally assign to it. It would propagate along the same axis of interdependence, such as energy markets, regional proxy conflicts, migratory flows, and environmental disruption, that the Ukraine war has already rendered visible as constitutive features of contemporary violence. The Strait of Hormuz alone carries a fifth of the world's oil supply. The ecological, economic, and the humanitarian consequences of its closure or militarization would be planetary in scope, not regional. This is what the geo-ecological framework of a final essay insists we see, that there is no longer any localized war. that every military confrontation at this scale is also confrontation with the planetary condition of human survival. I want to close by returning to where we began, to the interval, to the suspended moment between Achille and the Priam. We are right now in a moment that feels very far from that interval. The political actors currently orienting themselves toward war with Iran are not interested in intervals. They are not interested in recognition, in reciprocity, or in the acknowledgement of a shared human condition. They are operating entirely within the logic of force, and they are doing so with the confidence that the entire argument of this book is dedicated to exposing as structurally delusional. But this is precisely why the book's publication feels not merely timely, but necessary. What Balibar offers across these three essays is not commentary on current events. It is something more durable and more demanding, a set of conceptual instruments for understanding what force does, to those subjected to it, to those who wield it, and then the political order that deploys it as its final argument. Force is always reversal. This is what, in my opinion, Balibar emphasized through these three essays. The machinery of dehumanization always eventually turns on those who set it in motion. Ecological disaster. The fantasy of sovereign mastery is always, in the end, exposed as hollow by the very violence through which it asserts itself. And within that logic, against it and irreducible to it, there persist these rare, fragile, irreducible moments in which something else becomes possible. Recognition, reciprocity, the acknowledgement between enemies of a shared exposure to destruction. Tragedy is the name for the form in which that possibility appears, not as solution, not as redemption, but as an opening, as Balibar, after Weil, calls it the opposite of fate, uncertainty. The momentary suspension of necessity in which justice, mercy, or another path becomes thinkable. In a conjuncture defined by the naked assertion of force, by a political formation that has mistaken the staging of power for the exercise of sovereignty, that is moving toward war with Iran, based on the fantasy in its ideologically incapable of subjecting to scrutiny. This is not a small thing to say. It may be the most necessary thing that philosophy can say. That's why we need philosophy. And it is why this book, which moved from Homer to Clausewitz to Kiev, and which speaks in every register to the present moment, deserves to be read now, and urgently, and with the seriousness the conjuncture demands. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Alex. I had the... Does it work? Yes. I had the privilege of reading your commentary, your essay. In fact, it's an essay. A few days ago, you sent it to me. I was not only full of gratitude, of course, but admiration for the idea you have found, picked up, so to speak, in my collection of essays, and the consequences you drew from there with imagination and impeccable logic. So listening to you, I was even more impressed. You know, I find myself in an extremely difficult situation. Not only because I have to speak about what I have written, although in a sense it was not written for that circumstance, so I would have to explain that. but also because I have been severely warned in advance by my gracious publisher that I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't do that. First, don't be too long. We know you. Of course, I'm not Jean-Paul Sartre, who in a famous moment of the 68 events, starting to speak at the Odéon Théâtre de France before a crowd of revolutionary students, received a little sheet of paper handed over to him on which he could read Sartre, sois bref. So he wasn't good at that, and I'm not either. And then the second warning that I received from Jana, linked to the previous one, the other side, in the sense of the same idea, was cut the preliminaries. Because the reason why you're always so long is that you spent hours in preliminaries. But this is a contradiction in terms. How can you continue if you are forbidden to begin? I mean, so this is she's terrible, you know. I have very seldom, very rarely met somebody like you, so generous, so intelligent, so reactive, as we would say in French. I mean, with whom the dialogue is so productive. And this has been the case for several years. And the occasion provided by the publication of these essays, the offer that you made me some months ago already to have something published as a first volume for your new series, added even more to that. If this were a book with a thesis, my idea about the war is the following, and my arguments for this to defend this idea are the following: 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. I just had to prepare a summary, but I can't do that because there's no thesis in that book, and therefore I'm a little afraid. I very much hope, of course, that there will be readers, you and possibly others, perhaps. I'm not trying to guess that, who will find something interesting, useful, perhaps suggestive, in this collection of essays, particularly in its at least indirect, but in the end not so mysterious relationship to the situation in which we find ourselves now. And one of the reasons why I am so grateful to Alex for his presentation is, of course, the fact that helped by the situation, the conjuncture, now April 2026. Works or it doesn't?
It works.
It works, yes. Which was not exactly the one, or when at the time when I assembled the essays, and could not be completely anticipated. He found a way, as you could hear, to suggest that the book can be read. Perhaps this is not the only way to read it, but it's one possible, and I agree, perhaps useful and interesting way to read it, as if it is saying something about the current war in the Middle East and particularly in Iran, which means that you can pull some ideas or some formulas from the various chapters and find what literally is not there in the assemblage, that is a kind of coherence or structural unity, so to speak, if you imagine that it says something about the war in Iran. And I'm all the more grateful and admirative for what Alex did, because, and this is of course something that touches me almost sentimentally. I mean, the entire book derives from the fact that wanting to offer something to Jana when she asked me, do you have somewhere an unpublished or hidden essay that you could propose for the collection? And of course, with the question of the war in my mind and before our eyes, and looking at this, at my drawers, I mean, somehow at my files, I said to myself, oh, I would so much like this essay on Simone Weil's interpretation. It's an interpretation. It's a poetic interpretation about a poetic text of Homer's Illiad, to find finally some readers. Because as you will see if you look into the book, the essay was written for a very honorable circumstance, and I'm most grateful to the invitation that I had received at the time, which was to present a contribution to an academic conference on Simone Weil. But like it or not, I mean, apart from the audience at the time and the readers who are, I don't have any idea if there are many or not, of the rather specialized journal Cahiers Simone Weil, nobody has had the opportunity to look at that. So the fact that Alex has proposed to expand, I would say, the idea and the terminology of the first essay around Simone Weil's concept of force. Force. Between French and English, there's not too much difference in the understanding of the term. It would be different if we had to move to German or to other languages. And so expand the understanding of this notion and the text around it to, so to speak, what's a good formula in English for the French tirer une flèche? You say shoot? No, you don't say shoot an arrow. You say, what does the archer do? He throws. File. No? Fire. Thank you. Fire an arrow. There's a place somewhere, I'm already losing time in my preliminaries. There's a place somewhere when Habermas, who just passed away, says about Foucault was a kind of internal enemy. He both admired him and disliked his philosophy. That Foucault had managed to tirer une flèche dans le cœur du présent, to fire an arrow coming from far away or from a different region, aiming at the very center, the very heart of our present, and that's what you have done. You pull the arrow from from Illiad and Simone Weil, something apparently idle, or, purely aesthetic. And I'm not apologetic about that. I mean, it's about tragedy, about the concept of tragedy, and you really aimed at the present. So that gives a possibility, I agree, and I thank you for that, to read the heterogeneity and the disorder and the constellation in the of these essays, as if they had a common stake, perhaps not an object, but a stake. Now, so I cannot do better than you, but I will, if you give me another 2 minutes, and so that we can start. So the discussion that I hope we are going to have cannot really be a discussion about my essays, because you haven't read them and I'm not able to summarize them in a few words. So that's absurd. So it can be a discussion about the idea of war in general. There's all sorts of questions, or it can be a discussion about the present, and perhaps it will be both. We'll see that. That is also a way of commenting on the possible meanings of a title like Sur la guerre, which is, of course, the most banal possible title. De bello, not de bello gallico, but de bello persiano, or de bello, or about the war in general. So is that about the idea of war, the idea of the concept of war? There's a concept of war, and it's particularly in the central essay, of course, that returns inevitably and predictably, I would say, to the famous definitions provided by Clausewitz in his celebrated book, which is not a book, or it's an unfinished book, Vom Krieg, on the war, and its problems of interpretation and its various uses. So there exists a concept, but I'm trying, although I'm taking this very seriously, I'm trying to not remain, so to speak, caught in the purely conceptual perspective. And so then war in general could be something like the specter of war, the specter of war, or it could be the prospect of war. And that leads, of course, to the other possible reading of the title, Sur la guerre in French. You wouldn't have that exactly in English. It's the interesting syntactic characteristic of the article. It could be heard as sur cette guerre, the war we are in. So are we in a war? Yes, indeed. How are we in the war? Directly, indirectly, which one, etc., etc. And that's the question you raise. And of course, I have no pretension to. I'm no strategist. I'm no geopolitician. I'm no nothing of that. So I will say one or two words about each of the parts, each of the chapters. They've become chapters, the essays, in this spirit, in this intention. Their unexpected, ghostly relationship to the present. Now, at the center of the commentary that I propose for Simone Weil's essay, I will not be able to hide from you, and it's not hidden also in the text, that I have a very special relationship to that text. There are few literary, always for each of us some, but few literary and or philosophical essays that really raise, I would say, strong or generate strong emotions from the reader that I am. And that is the case with that text. If you'll perceive it perhaps. So you cannot. Simone Weil wrote this essay, which is a commentary including original translations from Homer's Illiad in 1940, 1941. That is in the context. He was just returning, or almost, from the civil war in Spain, and she was witnessing the beginning of the of World War II. Certainly not already imagining the horrors, the genocide, etc., that it would generate, but keeping in mind very strongly, very powerfully, both, I would say, what she had seen, witnessed in Spain, and what she had heard from the previous generation. She was born in 1904, although she had seen that from, she was not directly involved, about the bloodbath, I mean the massacres, the horrors of World War I, from which derived fascism and all that. And in her commentary, which at some point whose object is tragedy, of course, is the tragic as such, which I suggest has affinities with Hölderlin's understanding of tragedy and so on. Except her basis is Homer and not Sophocles, but she at some point uses a quotation from an extremely revealing document. This is unknown from the French readers, but there is an American edition of erudite edition and commentary of Simone Weil's essay by James P. Holocare, who revealed to me the meaning of that quotation. Nous sommes les sacrifiés, nous sommes les condamnés. She puts that somehow on the lips, in the mouth of all the participants of the war described by Homer, in as much as they are sure to die, with few exceptions. And that quotation comes from a song. So Holocare documents that, which was officially forbidden from quotation and use in France until 1974, which is quite recent. And why that? It's known as the Chanson de Craonne. Why that? Because this song had been invented and used by the soldiers, the French soldiers in World War I, who in 1917 revolted against the war and demonstrated against the continuation of the war. There's a famous American movie about that with Kirk Douglas in the role of the French. How is it called? Path for Glory. Of glory, yes, yes. He's not very vraisemblable, likely as a French captain, but he's a marvelous actor, of course. And so the text is terrible, of course, because it is the text of the rebels, who the song, who explain that they are inevitably dying in the worst possible circumstances, with the nostalgia or the of the life which they will never retrieve again, their wives, children, etc., etc. And of course, there is a class element that is introduced as well in the song. Reason why it was. It's only very recently that these rebels have been more or less officially rehabilitated by the French Republic. They contradict, of course, the myth of the patriotic enthusiasm for the. So let's not be too long on that. So the central theme, or one of the central themes, which Alex beautifully isolated in Simone Weil's essay, is of course concerns the well-known Greek concept of hybris. That is the not only the arrogance, but the folly, the madness of the warrior who believes to be stronger, and therefore not only embarks or engages in a confrontation that he would control, but inevitably exceeds his own capacities, so that at some point, of course, and this is of course the destiny or the fate, he will find himself in the very position in which he had put his adversary, that is petrification in Simone Weil's vocabulary, the situation of the thing that is about to die without any possibility of resisting or counter acting. So this theme of the reversibility in both meanings, the reversibility of every relationship of forces encapsulated or incorporated in a situation of war and combat, and the more profound, in a sense, idea that the destructive drive, you have to use a Freudian terminology here, that is the best. This is the death drive in Simone Weil's description, inevitably, inexorably aims at not only at the destruction of the other, but at the destruction of the subject himself. Other terminologies could be used. My master Derrida, in many of his last essays, was fond of the category autoimmunity, and he made use of it in the context, particularly of the Iraq war after 9/11, etc., which, in a sense, is the background of my second direct background of my second essay. So that's something that, of course, Simone Weil comments in lyrical and poetic terms, but with a very real historical background behind her words, and without identifying or assimilating different conjunctures that are not identical, but that nevertheless share this common characteristic of exceeding, in fact, the limits, the borders of so-called political rationality, and this is very much what we are in now. Perhaps there is something that can be used there. So I'm too long. I'll try and be quicker on the next two. So the element, if rereading my essays retrospectively, leaving aside the contingency of their assemblage and so on, I asked myself, is there a question that links them to one another, or passes from the first to the second to the third? It, of course, in particular has to do with the very question of the possibility of politics, and that takes us to the second essay about Clausewitz. So I will borrow again a concept that has been used by some eminent colleagues and interlocutors of mine all my life. Roberto Esposito, the Italian philosopher, wrote several essays around a term which he calls in Italian l'impolitico. It's very difficult. I had terrible problems when I needed to translate that into English, because my translators didn't want unpolitical. They said this is not a good English, that doesn't exist. So they proposed apolitical, which is not at all what Esposito wants to say. The impolitical, the l'impolitique, or the unpolitical, is not what has nothing to do with the idea of politics. It's what subverts the idea of politics from the inside by bringing to the fore everything that contradicts. You mentioned that too, the logic of the complementarity and coherent relationship between means and ends. So that's what comes to the fore when the use of the means, instead of realizing or coming as close as possible to the realization of the ends, in fact produce its disaggregation and its dismantling. That's when politics becomes self-destructive. So which takes us to the second essay, and it's longer, but I have to be quicker. In a sense, this is very academic. I mean, at the time of the Iraq War, when your president, I mean, some of you, we are in America here, I mean, some extent, at the time, which compared to the current one looks like a very reasonable man, a little naive perhaps, but surrounded by experts, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, all these guys. They were imbued with the reading of Clausewitz. That was, or Clausewitz's successors. And of course, as we know, the key sentence, or one of the key sentences, the one that generated kilometers of commentaries in contemporary philosophy, particularly Foucault, but also Raymond Aron and so many others, is the formula that explains that war is the continuation, Fortsetzung in German, which beautifully expresses the metaphor, pushes one step further forward. So, which politics is the war is the continuation of politics by other means, or through the introduction of other means. There are variants, which Foucault and others suggested ought to be reversed in order to become completely intelligible. namely by proposing that politics as such, in as much as the essence of politics is conflict, of course. There's no politics if there are no camps, if there are no adversaries, if there is not a friend and an enemy, as Schmidt famously would say, ought to be considered as a continuation of war. So that the idea is reversible. Don't go into details. Foucault used that. That was one of his moments of virulent anti-Marxism, or at least a moment when he very strongly wanted to explain to his listeners who had, so to speak, for whom Marxism was the milk of their of their youth, that Marx did not understand completely what he was saying. If you return to some of Marx's most famous essays, particularly the Communist Manifesto, you can see that, in a sense, Patsy Foucault, he was completely aware of that, this reversibility. But then the problem which emerges progressively, that a critical reading of Clausewitz, I think, forces us to take into account, and I did my best, although in a slightly scholastic manner. This is in the first essay, perhaps I indulge myself too much in literature, but in the second, I'm very much a professor at the University of Irvine, where I was teaching at the time. I suggest, after many others, of course, that this correlation between the two forms, or the two concepts, war on one side, and therefore, of course, also violence, or the use of violent means, and politics on the other side, sovereignty, government, etc. This reversibility is a way of dialectically explaining and expanding a certain notion of rationality, or historical rationality. And now, of course, for some philosophers, Hegelians, etc., the core of that rationality, and that is very much as well the point of view that you may find in Clausewitz, who belongs to the same generation and the same caste. The core, or the meaning of that rationality, is a progressive control and regulation of social events and conflict by the superior power agency of the state. Of course, the rational state itself. There's a little tautological element there. And for their Marxist adversaries, Marx and then Lenin and then Mao, who undoubtedly produced an extraordinary interpretation of Clausewitz, the rationality is not the rationality of state and government. It's the rationality of the revolution itself. But to see the revolution, or the revolutionary process, as something rational is to imagine, or to assert, that there is a logic, that it leads directly or with some indirect accidents to a final result, which in some sense is harmonious, or is. I introduce another anecdote here. Once in New York City, in one of the big conferences on the idea of communism, that had been organized by Alain Badiou, and Slavoj Žižek and some others. taking place in a wonderful, some of you must know that place, wonderful venue, location near Union Square, which is Cooper Union. It's the old building of the trade unions, the American trade unions. My friend and somebody I admire and like very much, Slavoj Žižek, was speaking on the estrade. I mean, and he said, you know, the history of the Chinese Revolution in the 20th century, and now the beginning, it was some time ago, 21st century, is an extraordinary illustration of the Hegelian idea of the canon of reason, which embodies dialectical rationality as such. Namely, it seems to go in a direction, but in fact, in a latent manner, it is aiming just at the opposite of this direction. So the Chinese Revolution seems to be, in the end, a nationalist process, but don't worry. In the end, it will reach communism. And so I couldn't refrain. You are not supposed to do that. So I interrupted him from the audience, as you should do now. And I said to him, Slavo, how about the exact opposite interpretation? The Chinese Revolution seemed to be a communist revolution, which now leads to the perfect realization of an imperial national state. And we both laughed, of course. But the latent prerequisite of that is precisely the idea that you can find a rationality in history, and one key element or one key aspect of that rationality is the perfect or almost perfect reversibility of the two processes: war on one side and politics on the other side. And the entire objective of my second essay, which can also perhaps become applied to certain current events, is a kind of deconstruction, if you like, of that. Allow me that term, deconstruction. Deconstruction of this great metaphysical, in fact, it's called dialectical, but it's metaphysics equivalence, and therefore an attempt at showing that that Clausewitz himself would be haunted, so to speak, by the possibility, perhaps even the likelihood that the correspondence doesn't work, which leads to the idea that those who use war as an instrument for reaching political aims become the instruments of their own instrument. And when they become the instrument of their own instrument, an entirely different logic, so to speak, enters the pattern, whose effects are not predictable. So that could be associated with other interesting elements deriving from Clausewitz, of which perhaps the most obvious one is the famous thesis of the superiority of the defensive war over the offensive war. I had a conversation at Paris 8 2 days ago with friends and colleagues, in which some of us suggested, but we have to be extremely careful that perhaps what is taking place in this moment in Iran between the American army and power and Iran could become an illustration, a perfect illustration of the Clausewitzian idea that in the end defense prevails over attack. Soit bref, Sartre. Okay. So with this proviso, with this, that in Clausewitz's rationalist understanding of this idea, the superiority of the defense, the wars of defense, the Russians against Napoleon, etc., is something like a better understanding of the rationality of war. And if you ask me, when in the end President Trump, who already has had to explain a few hours ago or a few days ago that he needed to change his strategy, which you can hear as, in fact, I thought I had a strategy, but I had none. So that the Iranians who are crushed and destroyed as a country, etc., but who also keep something like a government or a state, etc., in the end could emerge as the victors of that war, that will not lead to peaceful order. That will not lead to a reorganization of the world in which we live around either legal rules or revolutionary changes, etc. And I'm trying not to be pathetic, but in both cases it will lead to catastrophe. And so finally the third, and I stop there, the third essay is an essay, I said to myself, you cannot just give, so to speak, as a reply to her generous demand. Jana essays which either take us back to the resonance of the most beautiful poetry of our culture, or give another example of an academic discussion of the axiomatic underlying Clausewitz's and post-Clausewitzian ideas of rationality, as if nothing is taking place in this moment, as if we speak only about the idea or the specter of the war. And of course, at the time, there were. I always warn my interlocutors and myself against the extremely dangerous possibility of selecting some of the current wars, or civil wars, or external wars, or even genocides, because they touch our states and our cultures more directly. So you forget Myanmar, you forget Kurdistan, or you forget Sudan, etc., and you concentrate on Ukraine because that touches it. But anyway, that was inevitable. And so I had tried in a public intervention with the late conversation with the late Bruno Latour at the very beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, to explain why I saw this conflict, and you said it, so no need to repeat it completely, as overdetermined in my old philosophical terminology. Not just a border conflict, I even said a war of independence, or between the Russian Empire and one of its former dependencies. The very category is disputable, but also a new episode in what I, with others, call the Great Civil War of Europe in the 20th and 21st century. It's not finished, which means that Russia is not an external empire or power, but it's also European. And finally, of course, because I was discussing with Latour, but not only for that reason, a global or an episode or a moment in the brutalization and becoming increasingly violent of every sort of conflict on the background of the great environmental catastrophe. But Alex, of course, took advantage of the fact that we are now several steps beyond that. So already in my footnotes, the ones that I added when I said, wait a minute, there's not only Kiev and Bucha and Mariupol and etc., but there's also Gaza, and as many of us, I imagine, I was completely obsessed. So that's another war, equally decisive for our future and touching every aspect of our internal politics and ideas, which brought back the genocide. I maintain this term. I know that it can be disputed, and I'm ready to accept objections, but I think we cannot avoid it in the most unbearable, perhaps, form, morally speaking. That is a genocide. It's not quantitatively the same as the Shoah, etc., but that becomes politically justified by its perpetrators in the very name of the genocide that their parents have escaped or not. And now there is Iran, so you're absolutely right. So this is another step beyond, and we seem to be living in a world where it's, let's use Benjaminian terms, as you did, where the state of exception is completely normalized, which means, you could put it in other terms, that it is not the case that wars are moments of interruption and abnormal disruption of the social order, which more or less could be described as peaceful or regulated, I would say, but it's just the opposite. Just the opposite. If there are places of peace, if you can say that in English, my English is, or if there are moments of peace located in some parts of the world, more or less protected against the contamination of the general situation, they are the exception. They are increasingly the exception. And that, of course, is both tragic, hence a possible reference to what Simone Weil wrote, and irrational, at least in the classical sense of the term. Too long, wasn't it?
Sartre. Anyway. So I would like to thank both Alex and Etienne for these amazing speeches. I had obviously a lot of questions and wanted to kind of animate the discussion. But since I also want to give space to you to ask questions, I maybe just combine all of my questions into sort of a mishmash, into one question, just a brief reaction to what you both said. I was thinking about it because I wonder to what extent the contemporary war conflicts can be read through this notion of tragedy. Because obviously tragedy itself has it's in a very different logic because we have catharsis. I would perhaps argue that in what we're seeing now, it's a danger of something that obviously, has been already discussed with the First World War. When we think of the novelist, like someone like Hašek, the Czech novelist, and with his brave soldier Švejk, showing the absurdity of war, the cruel absurdity of war, as precisely these kind of conflicts without any form of catharsis that would be possible. I also wondered to what extent in both talks of both of you, actually this notion of the objectification of the subject really came into forefront. And then what would then be the relationship between this objectification of the subject and the very reification as the, a key process inherent to the capitalism? Perhaps there would be a way to really think the war as an kind of an extension of, this dev drive that is inherent to the organization of capitalist economy itself, with precisely this kind of a objectification of the subject or the reification. To what extent could we actually connect those two concepts here, and then perhaps ask what's the difference between force and power? So again, I don't want to talk too much because we really want the questions from the audience, but that was just my reaction, and I wondered if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, thank you for question. And then I think I would respond from my own perspective. When I read the Etienne's the essay on the Simone Weil, the concept of tragedy, I quite I was really actually inspired by Walter Benjamin, Walter Benjamin again, because Benjamin's concept of tragedy is a Trauspiel. But very interestingly, actually, Benjamin took that concept. The Trauspiel is the German tragic drama, and then if I properly translate in the English, but was mourning play in recent translation. It is about that some emotion, which must be shared by both sides, who actually suffered from force, and at the same time those who wield that force. So. But in Benjaminian sense, that the moment of mourning play, and that means the moment of that tragedy, is related to the very strangely the Übersetzbarkeit that is a German. It means a translation, translatability. So translatability, that is a very interesting. Actually, Benjamin used this the German word is a Barkeit. Actually, he put lots of the word he put this Barkeit in this term is on the noun translation, and then he actually put this Barkeit the next the noun, and then translatability. That is I don't think actually the English can translate it, but anyway, just Übersetzbarkeit means what is a mutual actually the exchange of the kind of the emotion. So because actually ancient Greek, according to ancient Greek, actually the tragedy, this term share the same etymological, the root with tear is the destroying, So according to Benjamin, only things human being can do is destroy, destroy what God created. That means only God can create, something. But the only thing we can do is human does is a tragic action against that what is created. Think about it. You actually the urbanization is a modernization. If you actually try to make some beauty, you must destroy the matter. You must destroy such an object. So that is what Benjamin thought when he actually discussed this meaning of a Trauspiel. And then it might be connected to what? The translatability. That means if you want to translate something, you must destroy it. All right? So that is exactly actually really corresponded to what the Etienne discussed in that his own interpretation of Bay, very reversibility. reversible. And reversibility is definitely transferability in the Benjaminian sense. That when we destroy it, what happened? That kind of space will be open. Is a suspension will be open. Some what I mean actually what, the where divine violence engaged. That means actually creation will come up through this kind of some tragic moment. That means openness. And then this creation would what? Be the ability of translation. So how can we make this actual ability, those translation? I think only a revolution, that what the Etienne's term is politics. Politics against the war. So I think that is a very important point you can read in this essay. He actually at some point, taking Clausewitz, the concept is continuation of politics, war as a continuation politic, or some Foucault, said is taking actually, the Thomas Hobbes, concept of a Leviathan, and then he talk about the, situation, the Leviathan situation Leviathan as such is continuation of civil war. So, but the war is actually a lot of, there's some even Clausewitz in the thought, the war is a kind of something happened within this frame of a state, but Balibar's reading and even Bay's reading, and then the Benjamin's actually concept tragedy didn't say like that. The politic, we should actually take on this politic against war, and then this actually war would open the the struggling side of politics, but we should actually look at this the political moment, not just the tragedy of war as such. The war is always tragic, but we should take on this political moment. And how can we organize this politics? How can we actually revive this politics? In my own term is a revolution. Always war is broke out against the revolution. How can we rethink revolution these days? That's what I have in my mind when I read the Etienne's essay.
You said everything. No, I'm sincere. I mean, I can only repeat more or less what. And of course, I completely agree with your idea and your formula that the great question is how to think of and to invent something that we could call a politics against the war. Now, what's interesting is that in the current in the situation where we are in our countries, in our circles, I was about to say, among our comrades, if you allow me this old-fashioned way of speaking, there are several formulas. Everybody tries to find the words. Everybody tries to identify the thing, but to identify the thing, you need to find the good words, and particularly those which will speak to others and produce something like a common move or affect. So let me mention only two of them. There are many others. One of them, my grandsons are very active in this, is a movement called guerre à la guerre, war to the war. So it's very militant, of course, but that doesn't entirely clarify how you wage that war. Is that a war in the same sense, or is there a kind of intrinsic dissymmetry, etc.? So if the war, guerre à la guerre means that you try and, I don't know, attack the military bases, etc., first of all, you're doomed to failure, and second, that's not exactly putting an end to the logic. So it's a good, it's a suggestive formula, but also very enigmatic. And then when the war in Ukraine began or started again. You can discuss about the very beginning. The European left, to put it in extremely general, vague terms, was divided clearly, very clearly. There were strong lines of I leave aside my old friends from the New Left Review and so on, who are completely attached to the representation of the struggle between the imperialist camp and its enemies. So there's one imperialist camp, NATO, and all others are one way or another on the good side. And so the Ukrainians are puppets in the hands of NATO, etc., etc. So leave that aside for the moment. But then in Italy, for example, where the tradition is very strong of resisting to precisely NATO movements and operations, because they have military bases there, which we in France don't have, foreign military, in Germany as well, of course, etc. They used, many of my friends, Sandro Mezzadra, for example, close to Tony Negri, used a formula that is now already used, but from my point of view it was questionable. I said almost the opposite at the time, which now is becoming progressively meaningful and influential, perhaps in the US. Namely, this is not our war. This is not our war, and therefore we should. So in the disertare la guerra, we should, so to speak, escape as a deserter. There's a good, the real American term for that is deserter is, what is it? Anyway, well, I'm sure you understand. You understand. So the question, again, the question is pushed to the next step. How can you, est-il possible de déserter une guerre généralisée? That is, where do you go? Which would somehow be immune to the effects and the logic of the war. So I'm not against that motto, but as a motto for a politics against the war, but it's inevitably remains problematic. So I wanted to say something again about Simone Weil, but I perceive that you are against that, so I stop there.
Yeah, thanks everyone for organizing this. I look forward to reading the book. I also wanted to ask a question about the politics against the war. And you mentioned like deserting in Sandro Mezzadra, etc., but also another category that has been circulating and revitalized, another political, philosophical category that has been revitalized is internationalism. Internationalism. And I think I remember in the past you've been writing about it in terms of its philosophical register from cosmopolitics, derived from Kantian philosophy, whereas internationalism more several sources, but including Kant, and internationalism in a more dialectical Hegelian Marxian register. I wonder, given the war conjuncture, the global war regime, as Sandro Mezzadra might call it, what becomes of the category of internationalism philosophically, and I think politically, and I say this as Iranian researcher or activist, we have been encountering very difficult circumstances when divisions among the left arises when it comes to Iran and the tendencies, the campus tendencies, I would say, that you already mentioned, that glorify the Islamic Republic of Iran as an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial force, whereas in reality it has nothing to do with that. I want, just these two interrelated questions, internationalism and
I do believe that that this category, internationalism, is not only useful but urgent. I mean, necessary, provided you rethink its content, its historical references, its application, and so in a recent thick book that I published with the title Cosmopolitique, I included essays which try and work intellectually and historically on the correspondence between these two categories that we inherited from our philosophical past, namely internationalism and cosmopolitanism. So there are interesting, but we don't have time for that now, a historical moment when they overlap, they are practically equivalent. It's very interesting it's frequently believed by Marxists or scholars, etc., that Marx and Engels in their Communist Manifesto more or less advocated a kind of proletarian internationalism because of the motto, proletarians of the world unite. You will never find this category in their text. It was invented by Stalin much later. But on the other hand, and my friend Michael Levy instructed me on that, I'm extremely grateful. Until the very last moment, they had used the category cosmopolitanism. And finally, it's not there. So the text is, so to speak, suspended between these two conceptual references, one which is its past in a sense, and another one that is its future, or in an organizational term, and it certainly tries to find a kind of synthesis. So I believe that we need that kind of synthesis today more than ever. But then if you jump to the next moment to which I alluded, when internationalism, and that's why the idea was systematized, etc., came again to the fore. That's the moment of the war and of World War I and the October Revolution. So it's Lenin's famous motto: "Let's transform dialectically, etc., the imperialist war into a revolutionary civil war," which means that the internationalist position is the one that substitutes the revolution for the imperialist war. So I don't say this is absurd, except I absolutely don't see the current situation as one, even leaving aside the consequences all this had. They were not inevitable. I mean, it's a complex story. I in a sense, I'm faithful to what I believed a long time ago. I do believe that the revolution put an end, in a sense, to the imperialist war that devastated Europe at the time. But honestly, I don't see the way you would apply this kind of motto in the current situation, or you have to endow, so to speak, the word revolution, and that's something valuable in my eyes, with a much more ideal, I would say, if not idealistic. Back to Benjamin, I mean, the messianic content of the idea of revolution, which doesn't indicate a strategy, in a sense, but which forces you to imagine, to think that a situation there is no fatality in the situation in which we are living. Therefore, something like an interruption and a reversal of the tendency is imaginable. Now, the only thing I would add to that, because you speak as an Iranian, and I hope you would not see this as a democratic salute, etc., is that when a moment ago I was suggesting, like others, that perhaps the development of the current war not lead to the full realization of the intentions of the American invader, but might provide the Iranian state with a kind of victory. One of the reasons why I see nothing hopeful and desirable in that perspective is that the Iranian people is completely absent from such perspectives. Right? So the Iranian people is the third term, which now in the current situation, implicitly and perhaps even explicitly, if you listen to certain voices, would say something like neither nor, neither the victory of the invader nor the victory of the Islamic State. And therefore, of course, the subject or the virtual subject of another politics is there, but the political implementation, I would say, and organization of its force is not given, and that's where international. I had said the same about Gaza. I mean, I was. Excuse me, I'm again too long, but I had said about Gaza since the very beginning. Two things. First, the death strike is devastating the place. The retaliation from the Israeli army and state will be not only brutal, violent, etc., but take the form of extermination. And that led me to saying that Hamas, so there's this whole dispute, is that what they did, was it an act of resistance, was it terrorist? It was both. Did something which not only was criminal and unacceptable in terms of killing civilians, raping women, taking hostages, etc., but catastrophic for the Palestinian cause itself. So again, you find yourself in a kind of a situation in which you have to say carefully or imagine that the real subject who needs both emancipation and support can be identified with neither of the direct adversaries. And that leads again to the question of internationalism. The Palestinians will not, if they still have a possibility, and I'm not completely sure of that, the Iranians perhaps more, but the Palestinians, to prevail or have their interests recognized in that situation. This is, of course, with the absolute precondition that they are helped, surrounded, supported, allied, etc., with many other forces in the world, and that's internationalism, not only Arabs, etc. But so that's why I know that this is very little, and that's why I find that the global flotilla is something important, and so on.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Caroline Holmqvist. I'm at the Swedish Defence University. Thanks so much for a wonderful panel. I just wanted to go back to where Alex started on Simone Weil's interest in what war does. It's a preoccupation that I've had in my own research for many years, because of course so many people are interested in war as something that can be controlled, something that can be strategized, something that can be planned for, that can be decisive, that may have a cathartic moment, that can be ruled by politics. And here, of course, that duality in Clausewitz, the instrumentalist understanding of war as the continuation of politics or being subject to political control, versus Clausewitz, the philosopher, Clausewitz, the phenomenologist, who is interested in the clash and the generative forces and the excess that always takes place, and the fundamental uncontrollability of what happens in war and what the consequences does. So, for that reason, we should look at what war actually does. We should center injury and human subjects and human bodies and so on. So my question, I guess, then is, why is it that it's so hard in political discourse to do that today? I mean, we have people like Judith Butler, who has argued that some lives are, just apprehended in a different way and become precarious and are never counted as lives and therefore not in death. So on. I mean, there are various kind of. But if I could ask your opinions on why is it that it seems so hard to center the violence of war? Yeah.
Shall I put it first or
Quick.
quick? Okay. Very negative. I think because we are caught between we're intellectually caught, prisoners caught between the collapsing and disaggregation of the collective political subjects of the previous era, and the invasion, I would say, and hegemony of the so-called geopolitical discourse, which I see as an absolute perversion of the situation in which we are. But that's very negative.
Yeah, so I think we need some macro perspective on today's situation. I already actually Etienne also emphasized that it's nothing new one actually. When you face up this kind of war is always in the human history, But the Marx is, as far as I remember, but I might be wrong. But in the third volume of Capital. Discussed very interestingly the situation in 19th century similar to 16th century in Europe. The globalization. All right. Actually, we forget. We already forget. What happened in the 16th century. I mean, before the 16th century in Europe is 14th and 15th. Okay, we remember that as period as Renaissance. But Brodel, President Brodel actually. Beautifully described that through the concept of Mediterranean is we already had an early version of globalization, and then but actually that globalization ended up with what is imperialist war, against what indigenous people. That's what Pedro Castro actually argued that many ends of the world already happened in the 16th century, right? And another one. Not many people actually remember this situation we had in 1970. That history also forgotten, the red globalization after the death of Stalin. Khrushchev, actually, I think Etienne would know this one, is what is that? Is that they created, the socialist bloc, created, the really similar situation to the neoliberalism. Actually, they created actually the International Division of Labor. That is the beginning of, that means they built their own trading network, like actually today's globalization. So that means actually that invented this idea of kind of some global value chain, against the capitalism, very strangely. But after collapse of Soviet bloc, as you know, because of this actual Soviet bloc, the main socialist the bloc, this kind of some idea of radical globalization, the social bloc is collapsed. Why? Because of oil shock. Because of oil shock. And now we have similar situation, but radical globalization already finished, okay, ended up because of this oil shock. And then another one is beginning at the moment, okay, is another globalization finally ending at the moment. I think, as Etienne emphasized it, I think we are really, really fear about this, the situation, if actually this kind of globalization ended, because we don't have any alternative. When actually, the red globalization collapsed, actually we had some dream about victory over liberalism, all right, as Fukuyama actually, Fukuyama changed his opinion these days, but anyway, in those days he had some optimistic, vision on the world, and finally history ended, okay? But that is a kind of alternative. We have finally had alternative, something like that. It's very optimistic idea there in the beginning of globalization, even though it is capitalist globalization. But now is we faced up total failure of modernization, all right? But I think this is obsession your Western people had. You must pay attention to so-called the rest of the world. This Europe as such today, in my opinion, invented in 16th century. That is so-called. Of course, Enlightenment, brought us really actually, precious values. Actually, Etienne always, discuss it. Equal liberty. This is so important, equality and liberty. Actually, these, values changed whole world. I really actually, accepted this idea, but also capitalism destroy, But we should actually rescue this value of enlightenment from this capitalist globalization, and we don't have any alternative at the moment. That's why, in my opinion, we need philosophy, and we need to rethink the failure in past. The only philosophy can do that, or some art, or some science. Okay, just science is now trapped by the so-called AI industry, techno science. In my opinion, after Second World War today's AI is definitely this dominion of this kind of techno science. All right, we should actually develop another idea of technology against this one. Through this artistic. Actually, the 1920, 1930, actually our artist, is avant-garde, the artist movement is also influenced the rest of the world. We had this kind of world, but it's not just actually shaped by this kind of the dominant power, but we also have lots of history of resistance. And I think that might be our task, even though we actually are living in this kind of tragic moment, but we need to actually rethink this failure. That is the only way we can learn something from the past. So I'm thinking actually I think this book is in this sense very timely. You must read this book and then discuss it. Then rethink what happened. The previous time, and then we can find out the alternative. That is, in my opinion, urgent. The demanding. From the past. Thank you.
I think this was a really beautiful conclusion, actually, and a very good conclusion about why we need philosophy. So on this, I would all invite you to have drinks with us. We finally got our courtyard back. So again, I'm sure Etienne would be happy to sign some books if there's time for that. And let's all have a drinks in the garden. And thank you so much, everyone.